One of the most overt examples of an author inserting their fetishes into their story was the creation of the Asari for Mass Effect. These space bimbos have evolved the ability to use DNA from another species to father their offspring, preferring to have another species father their offspring over breeding with another Asari. This brings up the question of how the Asari evolved like this before they made contact with sapient aliens a few thousand years before the games take place. Hidden in the lore are mentions of a species called the Manal, described as the Asari chimpanzee, being brought back from the brink of extinction. In addition, the planet Velius is named after a mythological Manal who would seduce and impregnate young Asari. Based on their description, it would appear that the Manal is not a sapient race but is in fact an animal split from the Asari by a common ancestor. This all but confirms the Asari evolved to engage in bestiality with fauna native to their homeworld. Street Fighter VI takes place about a decade after Street Fighter V, with many of the reoccurring child and male characters having been redesigned to appear older to remain consistent with this. On the other hand, the three returning female Street Fighters Chun-Li, Juri, and Cammy have remained visibly unaged. This is an example of the bizarre nature of the floating timeline, where characters in fiction remain largely unchanged by the effects of time while the world around them changes. This has actually been the case with the entire Street Fighter franchise, with Chun-Li having been born in 1968, Cammy in 1974, and Juri sometime shortly after Chun-Li, based on Street Fighter II and IV lore. It's just more noticeable since, unlike those previous games where everyone remained unchanged, we now have some characters who do age. Cammy White is by far the most prominent character in the Street Fighter franchise from the United Kingdom. The only caveat being the fact she's not a native Briton. Cammy was actually created as a clone by Shadaloo, serving as their mind-controlled assassin. She was eventually freed from her mind control, but suffered from amnesia. So when she began living in the UK, she ended up adopting the local culture. While Cammy's true country of origin is never stated outright, the most likely candidate is Germany. This is because another Shadaloo clone named Falk, who is probably one of Cammy's sisters, wasn't brainwashed and was raised in a facility in a German-speaking country, alongside Ed, a German boy who was kidnapped by Shadaloo and kept at the same facility. Another connection between Cammy and Germany is Shadaloo's Dolls unit, which Cammy led. The Dolls were overrepresented by Germans, with 3 of the 12 members being from Germany and only 1 member each from any other nation. In the Metal Gear Solid universe, Barack Obama is referenced multiple times as the President of the United States in 2009. However, due to the alternate history of Metal Gear, it was impossible for Obama to have won the 2008 presidential election. In Metal Gear Solid 2, it is established that the Republican President George Sears was forced to resign due to the political fallout of the events of the first game, which took place in 2005. With his successor James Johnson appearing as the president in 2009 before being assassinated and having the vice president succeed him. The most likely scenario is that Johnson was Sears' VP at the time of his resignation, with Johnson getting elected to another term in 2008 with Obama as his running mate. Then, when Johnson was assassinated, Obama succeeded him as president. This also makes it highly improbable that Obama ran as a Democrat, since Sears and Johnson would both select a VP from their own party. Despite the fact many video games use real-life firearms, the styling of those guns can vary radically between different titles based on the work of the artists. For instance, in the 2009 Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, the M240B machine gun is rendered with a fictional ammo box set underneath the receiver based on the ammo box used by the M249. This would actually render the weapon non-functional in real life, as it ejects spent casings from the bottom. That did not stop DICE from copying the same ammo box onto their M240B in the 2011 Battlefield 3. Or to continue using that same design for every incarnation of the M240B in Battlefield, with the latest being in the 2021 title Battlefield 2042. There's a lot of news out there about alternative fuel sources like methanol, hydrogen, and ammonia being a more environmentally friendly alternative to conventional fossil fuels. This is entirely bunk, though. The problem is that even if these fuels are technically cleaner out of your tailpipe, they are primarily sourced from fossil fuels. Even if you were to use them with our current economy, the greenhouse gas emissions would just come out of someone else's tailpipe when they burn the fuel you didn't use. The good news is that we can produce those fuels in a carbon-neutral way, using low-carbon electricity to synthesize them. But the same can be said about distillates and gasoline. This means that even if we were making carbon-neutral alternative fuels, we could also make the much easier to store and much more energy-dense fuels we already use. So why bother downgrading? You've probably seen images like this one pointing out the orders of magnitude greater energy density of uranium compared to hydrocarbons, but this doesn't tell the entire story. Unlike fossil fuels, which are concentrated in deposits, uranium is found naturally as an ore, which means that there are higher concentrations than background levels of the mineral located in certain rock deposits. Large amounts of ore has to be mined, then refined to extract the limited concentrations of the uranium, and finally enriched to make the fuel rods used to power a nuclear reactor, with most of the uranium becoming depleted. It takes 1 ton of uranium ore and the energy equivalent of 4,000 barrels of oil to produce 1 kilogram of fuel rods. Thanks to the massive upfront cost of nuclear fuel, a nuclear reactor's energy returns only beat out unconventional fuels like ethanol and shale oil. After Vostok 1 completed its world record flight, Yuri Gagarin went down as the first man in space, according to Soviet propaganda. But this was largely dismissed by most of the scientific community as his flight fell well below the informal boundaries of space. It wasn't until the Outer Space Treaty was ratified in 1967 that the boundary of space was legally lowered in order to prevent signatories from launching nuclear-armed satellites. This made Yuri Gagarin the first man in space on a technicality. Informally, the scientific community holds on to the more scientifically accurate definition of space, which starts beyond low Earth orbit, with the Apollo 8 mission from December 1968 being the first true manned spaceflight. Ironically, Yuri never lived to see real human spaceflight achieved, having died in a crash in March. In 1944, the Nazis introduced the Messerschmitt 262 as a combat aircraft. With its twin jet engines, it could easily outrun any propeller-driven aircraft on paper. But in practice, American fighter pilots found the 262 to be easy prey. This was because the 262 was deployed as an interceptor, meaning it had to climb to meet the American bombers while the Mustangs escorting the bombers would already have the altitude. The Mustangs could dive on the jets and fly faster than them with the help of gravity, making it impossible for the 262 to speed away. The 262 ended up becoming a laughingstock amongst the American pilots because it performed worse as an interceptor than the propeller-driven fighters. It operated alongside like the 109 and 190. Despite not being able to outrun a diving Mustang, a single-engine prop fighter was much lighter and therefore could maneuver better even in a low-energy state, making it a more difficult target for Allied fighters. During the Battle of Britain, the Messerschmitt Me-109 outclassed all British fighter aircraft in service. Since it was faster than even the famous Spitfire, Nazi pilots would exploit their speed advantage to attack and then fly away before the Spitfire could retaliate, giving them impunity in a dogfight. In spite of being able to fly with impunity, the 109 was not invincible because of its limited fuel capacity. The 109 had razor-thin margins of error when it came to how long they could fly over England before running out of fuel. As a result, while almost zero 109s were lost to British aircraft, they did take substantial losses from crash landing after running out of fuel due to pilots misjudging their remaining fuel supply. Saab places a great deal of emphasis on the fact that their fighter jet can land and take off from highways, but the reality is that this isn't a special characteristic unique to the Gripen. As long as a road is in good enough condition and meets the minimum requirements for takeoffs and landings, a fighter jet can take off or land on it. So what really matters is the minimum distance a specific model of plane requires. While the Gripen requires 600 meters to take off and land without any external weapons, the F-35B can take off fully loaded with 8,000 kilograms of ordnance within 180 meters and land vertically, in order to launch from the short runways of assault ships that lack catapults, making it a far more capable aircraft from austere runways. Because of concerns about Nazi heavy armor, the The British improvised a modified version of the M4 Sherman as a tank destroyer, mounting their 17-pounder anti-tank gun, replacing one Sherman in every cruiser tank platoon with the Firefly. This proved to be a grave error for a number of reasons. First off, while the Nazis had produced a few thousand heavy tanks throughout the war, they had produced hundreds of thousands of anti-tank cannons and millions of infantry AT weapons, which represented a much greater and ever-present threat on the battlefield that the Firefly was poorly suited to defeat. Even in tank-on-tank combat, the compromises in the Firefly design, like ergonomics and visibility, meant it had difficulty spotting and hitting enemy armor that a 75mm gun was typically adequate for anyways. As a result, the British retired the Firefly even before the war had ended, but retained the 75 and 76mm Sherman into the 50s. In 1944, the Nazis introduced the 128mm Pak 44 and the Jagdtiger, the heaviest operational armored fighting vehicle ever. These guns seemed like they would be overkill when the Nazis already had the King Tiger with its Magnum 88mm. But in reality, the Americans had been upgrading their Shermans to the point they were practically immune to all but the heaviest guns. Starting with the Jumbo Sherman, the U.S. Army realized they could double the thickness of the Sherman's armor with relatively little increases in weight, but these increases in protection could be applied more efficiently by thickening up the armor on the front of the tank, which is what would be facing the enemy in the majority of situations. As a result, by the time the Ardennes offensive began, most Shermans in American service had ad hoc armor add-ons made from scrapped tanks, specifically designed to withstand the main gun of a King Tiger. In 1944, the Soviet Union produced almost 29,000 tanks, significantly more than the economic powerhouse of the United States, which only produced 21,000 in the same year. So how is it possible that the Soviets could go from being unable to even provide food for their own people to outperforming American industry? Rather than being some sort of Soviet economic miracle, the answer actually lies with the economic support of the United States. Lend-Lease provided numerous industrial goods. For example, by the end of 1944, the United States had sent 5,949,000 tons of armor plating to the Soviet Union. This is by weight enough armor plating for the construction of 228,000 T-34 tanks. Thanks to American economic support, the Soviet Union could specialize their industrial output on making finished goods like tanks, planes, and artillery pieces instead of splitting their labor along the supply chain, while labor was at a premium. In response to the destruction of Turkish Leopard 2 tanks in Syria, Sweden opened an investigation into the procurement of the STRV-122, an indigenous version of the Leopard 2, which had been tested alongside the Abrams and Leclerc back in the 1990s. What they found was that the original testing and procurement of the Leo had been conducted dishonestly, with most of their written reports being gibberish, conveniently lost, or left completely blank. One of the most infamous examples being their conclusion that the Leo was better armed despite all three tanks having the same 120mm gun because the MG-42 on the Leo had a higher cyclic rate. The most generous excuse presented by the testers was that the entire testing process had been pointless because the Leo was by far the cheapest option available, and saying it was also the best without really knowing would make the soldiers more confident in their weapons. In 1987, the CIA acquired T-72 tanks in order to study their capabilities. The major concern of the Army at the time was to learn how effective the 105mm NATO tank cannon was against modern Soviet armor. While they were concerned the 105 would be inadequate, they actually found that it was overkill when using their standard armor-piercing ammunition, with this knowledge of Soviet armor. American tankers were actually issued armor-piercing training rounds for combat. Rounds like the M8, 6.5 were cheaper to produce, but still cut through the T-72 like a hot knife through butter. This policy of using training ammo against Soviet tanks was repeated in the 2003 invasion of Iraq and in the 2022 invasion of Ukraine with Western aid to the Ukrainians. In 2017, the German army launched a tender to replace the G-36 after HK refused to honor the warranty on the rifles and fix them. Germany eventually whittled down a dozen or so contestants to Haenel and HK. with the Haenel slightly outperforming HK in technical test and being offered at a much lower price, making it the no-brainer for adoption in 2020. HK's lawyers came to the rescue by suing Haenel for intellectual property infringement based on a different rifle that Haenel had already recalled and ceased production of in 2018 after a cease and desist from HK, and one of Haenel's subcontractors for technology that HK didn't even hold the rights to. This was because the German army couldn't buy weapons from a company that was being litigated, forcing them to reverse their decision and give a sole source contract to HK, who charged them €100 million more than what they had bid when they were competing with Haenel. In 1900, Browning introduced the predecessor to what would become the M1911, the Colt M1900. However, this design lacked one of the most famous features of the 1911, in that it was chambered for a .38 caliber, 9mm in metric cartridge of Browning's own design. However, starting in 1905, the Colt automatic pistols were rechambered to a .45 caliber as a result of testing conducted by the U.S. Army. The reason being is that Army testers had come to the asinine conclusion that the best performance characteristic for stopping power was how quickly a bullet would cause someone to bleed to death. This favored larger diameter, lower velocity projectiles instead of higher velocity projectiles like 9mm, which would penetrate deeper and had a greater chance to hit something vital as a result, which is what Browning and any intelligent person would prefer. As part of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was not allowed to adopt or export any weapon that hadn't already been in use by the German army in 1918. Before the rise of Hitler, the Germans deceived the Entente by claiming all of their new weapons were actually from 1918. The most famous example of this is the MP-18. This early submachine gun design had been intended for military use, but hadn't left the prototype stage when the war ended. Starting in 1920, a modified design that was intended to reuse surplus Luger drums to save money was produced, becoming the German equivalent of the Tommy gun, as police and criminals alike sought the premium guns. The deception was so successful that the MP-18 entered into pop culture as the world's first submachine gun, and the only submachine gun to be standardized in the First World War, despite the fact it didn't even exist until after the war. In 1985, the Department of Defense selected the Beretta M92 to replace the then standard M1911A1. Unlike most handgun designs, the M92 does not use a Browning tilting barrel action derived from the M1911. Instead, the M92 is actually an improved double-stack derivative of the Walther P38. On the other hand, in 1994, the German army adopted the Heckler & Koch USP to replace the Walther P1, a minor modification of the Walther P38 that had served as the primary handgun of the Nazis during the Second World War. Unlike the P38, the USP does use a tilting barrel design, being little more than an improved double-stack M1911. As such, the United States and Germany effectively ended up swapping to each other's World War II-era handguns decades after the war had ended. If you're interested in firearms, you've probably heard of the meme that revolvers never jam. This is actually just an exaggeration of the inherent advantage of revolving actions. Compared to an automatic firearm, which requires energy from firing to cycle the action, a double action or automatic revolver just requires the trigger to be squeezed in order to cycle to a different cylinder. This means that in the event of a dud round, you can just squeeze the trigger again to fire the next cylinder. Where a failure to fire on an automatic pistol would require you to remediate the action to manually eject and chamber the next cartridge in the feed. This advantage with revolvers may not have stopped them from being replaced by automatics, but they did find new life as autocannons, replacing conventional single-chamber autocannons with multiple chambered designs so that they could cycle through a dud round. Since it's impossible to manually remediate a machine gun on a fighter plane in flight. So remember, whenever you see a fighter jet, there's a little bit of cowboy DNA built into it. One of the most prolific anti-tank weapons of the Second World War was the Panzerfaust. This Nazi design projected a shaped charge warhead from a single-shot recoilless launcher, the first weapon of its kind, and a concept that is pretty much universal to modern militaries with weapons like the 84. Despite using technology that was novel and immature for the time, like shaped charges and recoilless guns, the Panzerfaust was a very primitive firearm in other regards. It was loaded from the muzzle and used black powder for its propellant. This wasn't just to make the Panzerfaust thematically fit with the Nazi infantry who were named after formations from the army of Friedrich the Great. The lower pressure of black powder compared to more modern propellants put less stress on the launch tube and consequently made it safer to operate. Throughout the Second World War, the Nazis' service rifle was the Bolt Action Carabiner 98K. Despite the fact that they had access to many different automatic rifle designs that would have vastly increased the firepower of their infantry, they never made an effort to standardize automatic rifles. The reason for this was simply because they couldn't supply enough ammunition to take advantage of the increased firepower. A Nazi rifleman was trained to fire 15 rounds per minute with a bolt action, where a similarly trained rifleman with an automatic rifle like the Gewehr 43 would be able to rapid fire about 3 times that rate. The State G44 was a bit better in semi-auto because its smaller cartridge required half the propellant, but on full auto, it was still consuming 3 times as much metal and gunpowder as a Kar 98K would over the same time period, which the Nazis simply couldn't produce. In 1990, the Swiss adopted a modified version of the SG-550 as their new service rifle, the STG-90. These modifications from 550 to 90 were actually intentionally designed to massively hamper the performance of the rifle. While the 550 used a standard 5.56 NATO cartridge, the 90 was chambered for the proprietary Swiss Patronen 90. Dimensionally identical to 5.56, the Patrone was designed to only be effective up to 300 meters so that the Swiss wouldn't have to renovate their firing ranges. While 5.56 NATO has an effective range of up to 800 meters from a full-length rifle like the SG-550. This is an especially questionable decision when your nation is a bunch of mountain ranges with long sightlines and all your neighbors use the longer-ranged 5.56. Back in the 1990s, Delta Force commissioned Heckler & Koch to design a new carbine. While the Deltas were almost entirely satisfied with their then-new M4A1 carbines, they were concerned about potential problems with firing the rifle while it was full of water. This isn't a concern for 99.9% of shooters, but JSOC often engages in swimming operations, and their commandos could find themselves in the position where they need to fire their rifle while they are in the water. In order to prevent high-pressure jets of water from being shot into the receiver of the M4A1, it had to be converted to use a short-stroke gas piston by H&K. Because of the added complexity of the gas piston, the resulting HK416 is heavier, has more recoiling mass when cycling, and a lower mean time between failure. But they succeeded in making an M4 that can cycle flawlessly underwater. One of the first programs by NATO when it was founded in 1949 was to create a standard rifle cartridge for all member states to use. The 2 most promising options were the American T65E5 and the German 8x57mm Spitz. The German cartridge may seem like an odd choice at first, but it was already standardized in every NATO member except for the United States from weapons left over from German occupation, or active adoption in the case of the UK, Canada, Turkey, and Portugal. Ultimately, the T65 was standardized as 7.62 NATO. After it was proven to perform better in testing, the NATO member states would have had to rechamber most of their firearms for either cartridge, and so it was in their best interest to rechamber to the best performing cartridge. By the 1900s, black powder had been rendered obsolete by nitrate-based explosives like nitrocellulose and TNT. Before this, militaries didn't have to think about where their explosives came from, since black powder was produced from wood and relatively abundant sulfur. However, despite the Earth's atmosphere being 70% nitrogen, concentrated deposits of nitrates that could be mined and used for making these new explosives were rare, with the most viable source being seabird guano off the Pacific coast of South America. In 1910, this problem was solved by a pair of German chemists who invented the Haber-Bosch process as a way to pull nitrogen out of the air. Originally intended for making nitrogen fertilizers, but easily adapted for making explosives for the military. Had this discovery been made just a little later, then the intense blockade would have made it impossible for the Central Powers to source the vast quantities of nitrogen they needed to mass-produce ammunition. In 1942, the United States was looking to introduce a common submachine gun design to the Allies. While the Thompson had good ergonomics and accuracy, it was slow to produce. The Sten was significantly faster to produce, but had poor ergonomics. Their wishes were answered thanks to the work of George Hyde, a native of Baden-Württemberg who had immigrated to the United States during the 20s. General Motors hired Hyde as they began gearing up to produce weapons for the war effort, and the U.S. military selected his design as the M3 submachine gun. The M3 was so successful it was copied all over the world and remains in use to this day, which is even more impressive when you consider the M3 was designed over a period of a few weeks and was produced at a headlight factory. Over the past few decades, snipers have achieved world record kills at longer and longer ranges. But these world record shots are actually physically impossible. Even in the perfect firing conditions at 3.8 kilometers, a sub-minute of angle rifle would have a grouping over a meter wide, making it impossible for even the most skilled sniper to accurately hit a target at those ranges, without having to take into account things like wind, gravity, and the loss of stability. At those ranges, no sniper would bother wasting their ammo and giving away their position trying to make such an unlikely shot. Instead, if they were to attack someone at those ranges, they would do so by spotting for artillery, which can eliminate a target at ranges beyond what small arms are capable of. With this in mind, you can safely dismiss most world record sniper kills as fake, either invented by the snipers who claim to have made them for attention or for propaganda. For a long time in the English-speaking world, there was a widely accepted theory that England was distinct from continental Europe during the Middle Ages, because it had a class of free peasants called the yeomen, who wielded longbows instead of fighting as knights. However, this narrative is contradicted by key facts. For starters, during the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor's bodyguards fought as cavalry. These men formed the nucleus of the yeomen of the guard after he was crowned king, and included men in their ranks who were obviously nobles such as the Earl of Oxford. In addition, the title yeoman is not unique to England. The most commonly accepted explanations are that it is a portmanteau of young man equivalent to the Germanic jonker, or the English equivalent of a gowman, which was a sort of assistant to a count. Bearing in mind that the title of knight literally means servant, most historians now agree that the yeoman was some sort of noble cavalryman. At the end of the Warring States period, Japan found itself with a huge number of swords on hand with almost no demand. This was because during the war, the Japanese had been mass-producing swords for use as sidearms. In addition, Tokugawa changed the law so that only soldiers and nobles could own swords, confiscating swords from anyone who wasn't allowed. He also restricted the length of swords and hilts so that great swords had to be cut down to the length of sidearms. With a massive supply of swords that could be preserved forever with no demand or attrition in peacetime, Japanese bladesmiths were forced to develop visually striking artisanal swords which were prettier to look at and sold as a status symbol to samurai. But these blades were unsuited for the rigors of combat. It wasn't until the end of isolation that Japanese bladesmiths had a demand for practical swords again. At the Battle of Agincourt, about 6,000 French soldiers died in a devastating military defeat, but not many people know the real events of the battle. During the battle, an assault by French infantry failed when the French surrendered en masse. After this, the rest of the French army, which hadn't been engaged, left the battlefield, ending the battle in a victory for the English. But King Henry realized that the prisoners outnumbered the men in his army and could riot, so he ordered the prisoners to be executed. Based on historical records, there were about 600 English killed during the battle out of a force of 6,000 men. So in order for the French prisoners to have outnumbered the English, they would have had to number no less than 5,400. Meaning that at least 90% of the French deaths at the battle were murdered prisoners of war. You've probably heard about the great lengths the British went to in order to disrupt the production of heavy water in occupied Norway. to prevent it from being used to create an atomic bomb by the Nazis. But the reality is that stopping the Nazis from producing heavy water didn't matter. Nuclear scientists had already deduced multiple ways to produce a nuclear explosion in the 1930s without using heavy water. The little boy dropped on Hiroshima was designed in part to operate without heavy water in their supply chain. What really prevented Nazi Germany from producing an atomic bomb was the massive economic investment that it would have required to produce enough fissile material for a nuclear bomb, regardless of if they used heavy water or not. Additionally, the Luftwaffe couldn't gain air supremacy over the Allies and lacked a bomber large enough to deliver an atomic bomb, making it a pipe dream for Germany to even pursue, hence the lack of investment.